Here we go with our next set of notes in our Evolution in Animals series, this one on arthropods. We'll talk about the characteristics of arthropods, as well as some of their behaviors like molting and metamorphosis. So to begin, we'll talk about some of the vital characteristics of the arthropod phylum. To begin with, it's a very, very diverse phylum that makes up pretty much most of animal life, both in numbers and number of species. So 3/4 of all animal species are arthropods, and pretty much the greater number of actual animals on Earth are arthropods as well. And just like all of the critters below these guys, they have 3 tissue layers. They have bilateral symmetry. They have a true coelom, so they're coelomates, and they also have segmented bodies. In addition, these guys have jointed appendages. In fact, that's what the word arthropod means. Arth means joint, pod means foot. Think like arthritis. People have arthritis, have swollen joints. So that's a defining characteristic of arthropods right there. They all have an exoskeleton made of chitin. It's a type of protein. It's actually very similar to the type of protein that makes up your fingernails, which is called keratin. They have cephalization, which means they have a brain, and they also have a ventral nerve cord. They do still have an open circulatory system, so the blood is still mixing. And then all arthropods also have a unique eye. They have what's called a compound eye. And if you've ever seen, like, in TV, they show like a bug's eye view, and you see lots and lots of images of everything because they have many different lenses. Another interesting trait or behavior that's characteristic of arthropods is molting. Molting is just the periodic shedding of the exoskeleton. They're not losing their skin, so to speak. They still keep their skin. They're just losing their suit of armor. And just like nobody would pay to make an expensive suit of armor back in the Middle Ages for a 10-year-old because they would outgrow it so soon, this kind of allows them to grow. They kind of get too tight in there, so they have to create a new exoskeleton. So they get rid of the old one so that they can grow larger. And then the disadvantage is, well, they're without their suit of armor for a little bit, so they're vulnerable to predators. They're also vulnerable to drying out if they're a land-based arthropod, because that exoskeleton helps keep the water and moisture inside the body. Arthropods also go through a process of metamorphosis, which is a developmental change in form. And when we say metamorphosis, we probably think of the butterfly changing from a caterpillar, a total change, into a butterfly, but there's actually 2 different forms of metamorphosis. The incomplete metamorphosis is something like what you see up here with this grasshopper. This is more of a gradual change, where the immature, the baby, the nymph, looks a lot like the adult. There's not a huge change there, as opposed to what you're more familiar with, which is complete metamorphosis. We have the different distinct stages of a larva, pupa, and then the adult. Things look very different, right? Like there's a very, very young lobster changing shape, and then eventually you're getting something that looks a bit more different, but definitely a very drastic difference between these two here. Or if you recall, back in our last unit we talked about crabs, how they were meroplankton. They started off being very different, being small organisms that grew up and became the crabs, right? These guys would be meroplankton. These guys then would not be planktonic because they could swim around and go wherever they wanted to go. And finally, we'll talk about our crayfish and some of its organ systems. So this is our representative arthropod. Of course, there's lots of variety in arthropods, but as far as our crayfish is concerned, it does have a complete digestive tract. Right? So food's going to move from the mouth into the esophagus, into the stomach. The digestive gland is going to play a role there, providing digestive enzymes and whatnot. The digested food is going to move to the intestine, and then eventually is going to leave through the anus. Respiratory system, they have gills. We know that. The gills look fairly similar to the gills that we've been seeing all along. And what's interesting is the way the gills are inside the shell, so they're protected inside the carapace. And then you'll notice the openings are very, very close to the legs, because as they move their legs, that's going to help circulate water over those gills and around in that compartment. As for their circulatory system, like I said a couple slides ago, they have an open circulatory system. So there are some blood vessels, but eventually things are mixing. As far as their nervous system goes, they do have a brain behind the eyes, and still with a ventral nerve cord. And with that, we are done with our arthropod notes.